Hi, today we were speaking to Alex Falk on meditation. How are you, Alex?
I'm excellent. How you doing?
I'm good, thank you. So to start us off, can you tell us a bit about your childhood life and when you were 16 up until where you are now, and what inspired you to go into the space of meditation and the work you've done?
Yeah, I had a really interesting time in high school, meaning I hated high school and rarely went. I went to four high schools in 2 years. So by the time I was 16 and your age, I already been kicked out of three different schools, and spent the end of my sophomore year in a transfer site, which is like a school for kids who are like suspended but in between. So I was dealing with a lot of different emotional issues, processing trauma. I had lost some friends at a very young age. The culture of New York City was really pulling me in a lot of different directions, and I was really passionate about music. I got into hip hop at a very young age. At around 12, I started writing, and at 16, when I was your age, I started performing, producing my own music, selling tapes at school. And I felt like school was really a toxic place where there was a lot of drama, a lot of conflict, and a lot of distractions from what I felt ultimately was serving my purpose, which was to go and be an artist and be creative in the world. And so, because of that, I spent a lot of time in and out of school or not going, focused on independent learning. And then I found a school with my parents as kind of like the last ditch effort to graduate high school. We found an alternative high school that allowed you to intern for part of your schedule and earn high school credit through being in the world of work. And the other parts of your day were in courses that you selected. So suddenly I had all of this autonomy and all of this agency over what I was learning and what I was choosing to do with my education. And once I got into that space, suddenly a switch flipped. And I was this really fully embodied person who was really passionate about the work that I was doing in school. And I had this incredible internship working with a publicist, who was working for, at that time, a young Jay-Z and Big Pun and Capleton and a bunch of really incredible artists. So I got to see a side of the industry that I wanted to pursue at 16, from a really in-depth perspective. And then I got to learn on my own. And part of that journey helped me to access some things that led me to meditation much later on, which was I went out into the world. I went to a music conservatory for college. I graduated. I worked as an independent artist, and I ran a label with a couple of my friends, and I'm doing all of this work. And I started to feel this really deep sense of dissatisfaction and overwhelm and stress. And, it's a very toxic environment a lot of times working in the creative industries. It can feel exploitive in a lot of ways. And I was feeling just overwhelmed by those feelings and didn't know how to process it. And I was also really interested in why music and sound in particular had always held a really deep spiritual connection for me in my life. So I started investigating and exploring, where do these worlds intersect? Where does spirituality, sound, healing, meditation all kind of intersect? And what I found was, through this work with sound therapy and sound baths in particular, a way of thinking about why music has such a strong pull for me, what has been this guiding principle and purpose for me in my whole life. How can I express it and interact with it in new ways that could help me manage my emotions better, manage my anxiety better, and really actualize myself in the world in a new way.
Amazing. So I want to go back to what you said earlier on about schools being toxic. What things in the schools make these schools toxic, and how can schools try grow from this and become good, well set out institutions in the world?
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I don't know what it's like in South Africa, but here our education model is very antiquated. It's really based on these ideas of a young person being able to graduate high school at 18 and go work in a factory and start a middle class family, right? And that is very clearly not the world that we live in. So the idea of work, the idea of the power structures and dynamics inside of these spaces is really outdated and really irrelevant. And then we've also slashed budgets for arts learning almost everywhere across the board in education. So if you are neurodivergent, if you learn differently, if you have a passion for creativity, there really isn't a space for you to learn and grow in there. And then that coupled with the fact that there was just like so much drama, so much animosity, so much bullying, so much classism and racism, all being unaddressed inside of these spaces, certainly when I was growing up, that it felt like there was almost more conflict and more anxiety and more problems inside the school than I was even experiencing outside in the streets in New York City in the 90s. So, I think the culture of schools that don't teach us how to practice empathy, how to find our purpose, how to connect to purpose, how to be explorative and inquisitive and question things, really felt out of accord with actual learning. And I think it works really hard to crush that joy for learning out of us in some ways.
Yep. So I'm going to change the topic more towards substance abuse and violence. And as a substance abuse and violence prevention counselor for the New York City Board of Education, you play a vital role in supporting young people and helping them overcome obstacles. Can you share a powerful story of experience that showcases the impact of your work on a student's life?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a very particular set of attributes that we try to place upon students, and I've worked with kids across a really broad spectrum, right? Because in New York City, we have very rich and privileged kids going to school with very poor and socioeconomically disadvantaged kids. And I have a really beautiful story about the very first student that was ever a client of mine in my group. So this student was fresh out of rehab. They had attempted to commit suicide through taking pills. They were recently transitioning genders. They were dealing with a alcoholic mother who was also verbally abusive. And they were in a very similar position to where I was when I was 16 and being kicked out of schools, not achieving academically, and really in a place where they were feeling lost and discouraged. The first thing that we started working on before we started counseling was starting to understand where they were from a holistic space. So what were the things that they were feeling, sensing, journeying with, and carrying into these experiences that were leading to such painful and horrific outcomes for them in their life? And what did they want to change? And so really giving them the agency to activate what they wanted and what they were seeing for themselves. And then in addition to just talking about, okay, you've had this very traumatic experience with drugs in your family, we're also focusing on what is something really beautiful and positive that you want to achieve in this life, right? If we took away all of that. And they said, I really love design. I love designing clothes. I love designing games, but I've never had the access to doing that. And so in our counseling sessions, we dedicated some time to breathing and meditating. We dedicated some time to affirmation. We dedicated some time to traditional talk therapy. And then we dedicated white space for them to just create for a while. We would do small, like, ideation sessions where they would get to just ideate, draw something, design something, have fun, play with it. Eventually, that student got back on track. They stayed sober for 2 years, and then they got into Cooper Union, which is a very prestigious design school here in America, one of the hardest ones to get in, with a full scholarship. So they went from being completely detached from school, in a psych ward, transitioning, struggling with their parent, to having this very beautiful, thriving design practice in an elite school and feeling really healed. And we stay in contact to this day. And actually, when they got out of design school, they decided to go into the healing arts. And so they work in body work and astrology, and they have a really thriving brand that's really beautiful. Um, so just the resiliency and the practice that young people take, and it teaches me so much too in these counseling sessions as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, I just think that's absolutely amazing that person was able to transition from in a hard space, almost reaching rock bottom per se, to becoming the person she is or they are now. It is amazing. I'm going to change the topic more towards the music and how has your background in music almost influenced your philosophy and approach to creating community and healing and shared experiences through sound and listening.
Absolutely, yeah. Excited for it. So for me personally, I grew up in what we consider the hip hop generation in the 80s. And so that work and that culture in particular, right, really grew out of the space of a group of young people saying, we have really nothing here, and we are going to manifest something out of this nothing, right? We are going to take very ordinary things, a record in our parents' closet, a cardboard refrigerator box, very cheap spray paint, right? We are going to take these very basic tools that get overlooked or just like nothing in our world, and we are going to transmute them into something extraordinary and beautiful and powerful. And in that work, that started as a young person, like we didn't have influencers in the way that maybe you guys think of it, right? Our influencers were people who were literally taking nothing, manifesting something into the world and showing us that like the potential is endless here and infinite. Um, and so that aspect of creativity being this driving force and being able to create from nothing hands you a lot of power. And I always felt a great sense of connection and power through imagination and being able to imagine things in the world. And I was watching this culture evolve around me that was just young people imagining things and making it happen against incredible odds. So that story of hip hop, and then when we think about what hip hop is as a culture, right? Like a lot of times we associate it just with rap music, right? But there's actually 5 elements to the culture of hip hop: graffiti, DJing, breakdancing, emceeing, rapping, right? And then that 5th element, which is really important, but we don't talk about a lot, which is knowledge and community. And so hip hop grew out of the civil rights movements of the 60s and 70s and the Black Panther Party and the Young Lords movements, which are all great things for your guests to Google and look up and investigate more. But this idea that there is a collective knowledge from the ancestors, from each other, that we are building on and creating legacy around. And so that idea to teach and inspire and hold present our ancestors and the ones that came before us and look into the future with that lens has been something that's been really present in all of my work and everything I do.
Yep.
And yeah, go ahead.
So I just want to go back to what you said earlier regarding manifestation, and you mentioned manifestation, which is almost, in my opinion, a very important tool which can be used to try achieve success and trying to set up your mind properly to try almost follow that path to success in setting up your body and mind to try almost go for it. Can you please elaborate more on how manifestation can be used to try achieve an individual's success?
Absolutely, yeah. I think everything in this world that we see, right, started with a seed, right? And it's an idea, it's something that we are transmuting through our imagination from some source around us, right? And when we are in right relationship with that, right, when we're really connecting to our creativity and our imagination in a genuine way, then we are able to set intention and then carry that intention out into the world. And I think that's where we start to see things manifesting, when we are planting that seed of intention and we're in the right space to grow it. And then we start to see it manifest around us and branch out for us. So I think the clearer that you become with your intention and what you're seeking to do, then you start to see that manifest in your life. And so I think that power of intention, that is really the engine that drives what we manifest, and having that clarity around what our intention is something that is really important.
Yeah. So there are also a lot of young teenagers that are dealing with obstacles and challenges in their lives. Are there any strategies that you've used during your meditation and dealing with these young students or pupils that can be used to try almost help people overcome their difficult circumstances?
Yeah, absolutely. I think when I think about meditation, right, I'm thinking about it as a strengthening of our relationship to the present moment. And it teaches us a lot about relationships. And I think as a young person, probably the primary thing that's driving your thought process is your relationships. Do you agree? Like, do you spend a lot of energy on your relationships and thinking about your relationships and how to grow them?
I would say so, but it's switched a bit in the last few years. Of course, I've sort of taken I mean, I'm currently filming this podcast in the holidays, as I've mentioned before we got into it. So I mean, my relationships are at the moment, because you always sacrifice things in your life. I think if you focus 10 hours a day on one thing, then the other thing that you obviously is going to drop a little bit. So I mean, I've really, for the most part, I think 99% of people spend most of their energy in relationships and trying to make people, have their relationship built. But for me right now, I'm trying to almost make sure my future is really a priority more than my relationships per se, which is not always a great thing. It can also be a negative thing, but I think every step you take or every drastic decision you make will always have a negative consequence per se. So if I'm going to spend 12 hours building a podcast, then that means I have 12 hours less with my relationships or my friends or all that sort of stuff. But at the same time, while doing this, you are right in saying that my energy is going into relationships, because I'm not doing this podcast alone. I have a team around me that's also helping it, and those relationships are also developing. While it's a tricky one, but yeah. So you are correct in saying that, yes, energy is spent on relationships. Yep.
Yeah. And I think a lot of times, right, like when we think about our relationships, we don't think about our relationship to our work, right? We think about it as just work, right?
Yep.
But in fact, we are in relationship with our work, right? And you are building, like you said, right, a team, and you are developing a voice, and you are developing these boundaries and recognizing the sacrifices that go into it, right? So meditation, I think, can help you understand that relationship better and understand that prioritization of where you are spending your energy. And that's all it is. My meditation practice for me is most beneficial because I carve out this very specific dedicated time for myself that is mine. And that time I am just in relationship with myself in the present moment and nothing else.
Yep.
Yeah.
And during these uncomfortable situations or difficult circumstances people might be put into, there's one thing we may encounter, which is addiction. And people in general, from what I've seen, almost turn to things that almost help them release their anger, or release their sadness. And generally those things are not always healthy, like drinking, smoking, vaping, all this sort of stuff is a release. Are there any other ways we can, through meditation per se, or without using meditation, release this anger or release this sadness during these bad circumstances, rather than becoming addicted to or to these horrible things that have been put in the earth?
Yeah, no, that's great. Yeah, it's important for us to recognize where addiction starts, I think, right? Because that's really something that you just tapped into that is beautiful. And I think it's very important, especially for young people, to understand that addiction is really about behavior, not substances, right?
Yeah.
So a lot of times we are thinking about, like, Is it the drug? Is it the cigarette? Is it the alcohol? Is it the vape pen? Is it the weed? Is it the heroin? Is it the pill? Right? It's not about the substance as much as it is the behavior. And the behavior is a response to trauma, right? And trauma is what happens inside of you, not what happens to you, right? So when we are dealing with something traumatic, we are looking for ways to, like you said, deal with that discomfort and manage it. And I think because of the way that we are kind of diverting our attention at all times, discomfort happens constantly. And we don't really have space to process that trauma because we can easily distract ourselves in so many ways. So when we are not dealing and confronting trauma and addressing those behaviors that we are using in response to it, that's when we start to form unhealthy relationships to different things in our life that we crave. We end up having really negative short-term relationships with that eventually end up becoming habits. And those habits that we form can become really destructive. And that leads to addiction because we have suppressed that trauma so much through this behavior, we don't actually know how to deal with or process the traumatic thing that we're struggling with.
100%. So I suppose there are two different groups of people we could sort of deal with here. The one which we've just discussed is the people who are sort of just starting to get into this trap of addiction. The other group is the people who have been addicted to a certain substance. The question is, how can these people get over this addiction of the substance? And is there any advice you would give to them to try and move forward rather than digging even digging a deeper hole of getting into this addiction?
Definitely know that you can seek help, that you are worthy of help, that you do not have to do this alone, and that there are important ways that you can support yourself holistically. And people, I think, feel powerless against their own habits and routines, and you do not have to feel powerless. You have to be able to accept and acknowledge help at some stages, but again, like, know you can get help and you're worthy of that help, and you're worthy of a life that is fulfilled and beautiful and joyful and free of addiction. And secondly, I would say talk therapy really helps in understanding how a substance use disorder develops. Because I think we talk about the consequences without talking about the how we get there a lot. And I think that's what people struggle with the most, is that it's very easy to point to or other people that are already deep in cycles of addiction. And it is a long process to get out of a cycle of addiction, but we don't talk a lot about how you get into a cycle of addiction and understanding the warning signs.
Yep. Can you elaborate on how we do get into the cycle of addiction, please?
Absolutely. So it's important to pay attention to how and what you're using, right? And are you using alone? Do you find yourself craving the drug, right? Like needing more of it, wanting more of it frequently? Is it interfering with relationships? Are you doing this thing and over prioritizing it instead of spending time with friends, loved ones, people that you care about? Are you noticing it's interfering with work, school? You're prioritizing this as the main focal point of your life. Are you paying attention to the tolerance levels that you're having, right? Are you taking more of it to have more of an effect? And then the last one that's really important to notice and be aware of is, are you experiencing withdrawal symptoms? And a lot of times we categorize or think about withdrawal as like people laying in the streets, like scratching themselves or talking to themselves, but they're really subtle signs of experiencing withdrawal, like insomnia and anxiety and fatigue and nausea and irritability even. And I think if you can be aware of when you are experiencing these things or seeing these patterns come up in your life more, you can start to mediate away from those things growing into a full-blown cycle of addiction.
Yep. And for those people that are experiencing these symptoms, how can they almost stop it or try overcome the symptoms?
Absolutely. So I think dealing with that core trauma and understanding how to work with it is a really powerful tool to maneuver away from falling deeper into cycles of addiction. So therapy is a really powerful tool. Counseling is a really powerful tool. Reduction is a really powerful tool. I think it's important to know that like these things exist on a spectrum, and going from 0 to 100 may not be the best mode for everyone. So taking small incremental steps is really important. If you're doing something every day, 3 times a day, can you do it 1 time a day? Give yourself healthy boundaries and then start to build new routines that take that place, right? So meditating is a really powerful experience to understand yourself, to process your emotions. Movement, creativity, connecting to your purpose, finding things that you love, tapping into a support system around you. If you feel like you're disconnected from that, starting to build one, right? Just like spending time with people. Again, it recharges us, it gives us spirit, it gives us value. Creating, same thing. Being able to talk and be vulnerable also is a powerful tool for healing. And I think there's so much healing that we need, and we need to know how to access it. So starting to access those healing tools can be really empowering.
Yep. So you mentioned meditation again, and you're involved in sound bath meditation. Can you please dive into more of what sound bath meditation actually is?
Absolutely. So a sound bath is a deeply immersive full body listening experience that integrates sounds of all kinds to help nurture the mind and body. So in a typical meditation, right, if you've ever meditated before, maybe your focus is on the breath, or someone is guiding you with their voice, or you're paying attention to a mantra. In a sound bath, the focus is just the ethereal nature of sound that's happening in the space and environment around you. So sound is your guide, and for a lot of us, that's easier because we all have a very familiar experience listening to sound. We've probably all had a really deep, transformative experience listening to sound, right? Like you probably have a favorite album or favorite song, or something that you put on to lift your mood up when you're feeling sad, or that makes you want to dance, or that you get excited to share, right? Those kind of experiences with sound are really powerful. And we've seen that through scientific studies. In just as short as 1 minute, deep listening and listening to sound can de-escalate our nervous system. So it's a really quick and effective way to also transition out of a heightened state. If we're feeling anxious, if we're feeling triggered, tuning into sound can be a really powerful tool. So that's kind of what's behind a sound bath.
Yep. And are there any specific memorable experiences or success stories that you remember that have showed the power of sound therapy and mindfulness?
Yeah. So I've been teaching a course in mindfulness for the last 7 years through my job. And I've seen this process of transformation happen so many times. Many kids come into the space with a lot of skepticism, with a lot of resistance. And subtly, as we start to explore this practice more and more, you can really see the value that it's starting to create in their lives. And slowly it becomes a thing that they're looking forward to at the end of their school day every day. And then it becomes a thing where they are actually taking it out into their communities and sharing their practices with their friends. And I have a lot of kids who have come back to me after graduating, who are now lifelong meditators, who now share this work with others. So it's really beautiful. And I think it also is something that creates community in a very unique way.
Yep.
Because people are engaging in a shared experience with one another, even though it is deeply individualized, you are sharing in that experience with everyone else around you. And I think that creates a lot of permission to feel safe into dropping in and to following through with something that maybe you wouldn't on your own, which I think is also a great way to kind of start a practice. If you have some community support and you have people around you who are sharing in that experience with you, it becomes really empowering and feels fun. So I've seen that happen time and time again, where kids feel really connected and in community with their classmates after going through this mindfulness learning with each other, which is beautiful.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a constant question I've asked all my guests since day one last year in December. And what is your personal definition of success?
I love that question. So I put success into three categories. So success to me is joy, creativity, and generosity. So doing anything with a sense of joy that connects you to that thing that lights you up each day, being creative, giving yourself permission to take risks, to challenge yourself, to be in tune with your own voice, to tap into that innate thing that we all have, which is to build and create and share. And then generosity, taking that joy, that creativity, and giving it to others and putting it out in the world. And so I think like any day that feels successful to me is a day where I have tapped into my joy, my kindness. I've done something creative and been creative in my space, in my field. I've pushed myself. I've given myself permission to be creative. And I've been generous with it. I've been giving. And I think if you can be joyful and creative and generous, no matter what field you are doing, you are going to find a ton of success. And bringing those elements into your craft is where the real value comes from, you know? And I think we get lost a little bit in this idea that success is attached to a number of likes or views or dollars in your bank account, right? We know a lot of people that are struggling with feeling empty and alone and depressed and sad and don't really feel successful despite how much money they have and success and fame and accolades. So I think when the effort is rooted in those three elements of joy, creativity, and generosity, you really feel successful, and that can come from any area of your life.
Amazing. And then to end us off, if you could go back and say one thing to your 16-year-old self, what would that be?
It gets better.
Amazing. Cool. Well, thank you so much. And I really do appreciate this opportunity to talk to you. I mean, yeah, you're an inspiration. So thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. And thank you, as I said before, for hosting this podcast and for inspiring your peers and for leading in this way in the world. It's really important.